The new doctrine says, 1. All whites are alike. 2. All whites are guilty and tainted. 3. No white person should ever criticize someone who's not white. London, February 2000. Victoria Clembier, an 8-year-old Ivorian girl. Starved and tortured, allegedly because her guardians thought she was possessed by demons. Rushed to hospital in a critical condition, Victoria eventually died of 128 separate injuries. The inquiry that followed blamed poverty, miscommunication, and incompetence. But for me, one thing came through loud and clear. Pretty much everyone who could have saved this little girl's life was walking on eggshells. Why? Because I think they were paralyzed by fear that if they intervened in a black family, they'd be accused of being racist. White managers worried about criticizing black juniors. Doctors attributed Victoria's scars to insect bites from her African childhood. Social workers saw the child's terror of her guardians as behavior typical in black families. Everybody said they cared. And still, she died. Rotherham, 2003.
When people are saying in Rotherham they didn't know what was going on, I can believe them because I didn't know what was going on. It was a bolt out of the blue.
That summer, the then MP for Keighley, Anne Cryer, was visited by a delegation of local women. What they told her left her aghast.
I had 7 mothers of 7 girls who were being groomed from school. These lads were waiting for them outside the school gate. And they flattered these girls, and the girls went along with it.
How old were they?
Oh, they were only about 12 or 13, very young. And this was the problem that their mothers had. They knew that there was sexual activity with girls who were underage. Not entirely, but nearly always, the gangs are from the Mirpuri Pakistani community. And these 7 women were saying, it's not fair, we've told West Yorkshire Police about it, we've told social services about it, and no one will do anything. I mean, friends of mine in the Labour Party, they'd known about it for years, and had never mentioned it to me.
Did you feel sort of, in any way, politically inhibited from talking about this?
Yeah, I did, actually. It was difficult for me to make these arguments without being called a racist. I just couldn't interest either Bradford Social Services or West Yorkshire Police. And it was very distressing for me. So the last resort was to go public.
Revealed, the teenage girls being groomed for underage sex. The accused men are Asian, the girls are white.
The suggestion that men are seeking out schoolgirls for sex would be controversial in any community. But the claims about what's happening here in Keighley are particularly incendiary.
Andrew Norfolk is now the chief investigative reporter for The Times. When he first heard about this story, his liberal angst kicked in immediately.
My reaction was, how on earth do you cover this story? Because it's the dream story for the far right. I as a journalist, wrote a simple story, a single story, and moved on and hoped it wasn't true. More shame on me, because as the years passed, I then began to see, as stories came in from across the North and the Midlands, little by little, drip, drip, court cases with 2 or 3 or 4 men up for sex offences against children, and that very same pattern kept repeating it and repeating itself, and I couldn't help noticing that invariably the men, they were from the Pakistani community in the vast majority of cases. Eventually it got to such a point that in 2010 I said, you know, to the newspaper, I think there's something really disturbing going on here and nobody's recognised it, and you need to give me some time to look into it. We'd run our first story about this hidden crime pattern in January 2011. And I'd steeled myself for the inevitable accusations that would come.
Did you think people were saying, this bloke Norfolk, he's a bit of a racist?
Well, they were. I read articles, I read comments on various social media networks. It was quite strange and deeply unpleasant to get to the age of 45 and for the very first time in your life be accused of being racist.
This is a story about what happens in a climate where people feel it's far too difficult to speak openly about race. Both Anne Cryer and Andrew Norfolk would regard themselves as liberal-minded people, yet they were vilified for saying something that liberal Britain just didn't want to hear. And once the truth was out, you'd think that the first thing to do would be to make sure that vulnerable children knew that they were at risk. That's why, in 2008, child protection chiefs commissioned this film to warn young girls of the dangers they faced.
My Dangerous Lover Boy very accurately identified the process by which a young teenage girl can get lured into a world in which they find themselves horrifically out of their depth. It had a young girl, maybe, what age would you guess from seeing her? 14 years old,
15,
maybe? 15.
Come on, baby, do you want me? Boy, don't you lie to me.
Full of adolescent frustration at the limits in her life and wanting to break bounds. A good-looking boy, a good few years older, but still a young man, maybe, early 20s, should we say?
Wanna come for a ride?
Turning up in an attractive car, music pounding. That initial attraction, the flirting, the excitement, the ride, is all so accurate in terms of the way young teenage girls take the first steps into this world that, in the worst cases, can lead to utter degradation.
It's all right. It's okay.
But however accurate the film was, there was one problem. It was never shown to its target audience.
What I was being told by the people on the ground who had been involved in making that film was that the single most important reason why that film has not been shown in schools is because the main groomer and abuser was an Asian man. And that was unacceptable. There was a terror of treading into what was seen as a cultural, ethnic minefield.
A second film was circulated, however.
My men, all right.
Look closely. It's not that hard to see the difference.
I'm Lauren.
Oh, Camilo, nice to meet you.
He's a white teenager as opposed to a 20-something Asian.
He's a lad barely a couple of years older than the girls involved. You have a cast that is all white or African Caribbean, and no Asian men to be seen, as far as I can remember, in the entire film.
Between 1997 and 2010, there were 17 court cases linked to the group street grooming exploitation of young girls. Those cases led to 56 men being convicted. 3 were white. More than 40 were Pakistani heritage Muslims. Altogether, they abused over 200 victims. And the numbers are still growing.
We've just had a report earlier this year in Rotherham, an independent inquiry that has said in a town whose Pakistani community is less than 5% of the population, 1,400 predominantly young white teenage girls have been groomed and sexually abused, and the overwhelming majority of men involved in that were of Pakistani origin. That's a pattern that's been repeated in Bradford, in Leeds, in Manchester, in Blackburn, in Rochdale, in Preston, in Blackpool, in Derby, in Nottingham, in Birmingham. There are reasons why that has happened.
I wonder if at the heart of this was a mistake that we all made, that we gave people a kind of cultural exemption from normal, reasonable, decent behaviour.
Yeah. I think you're right, yes. I mean, because if you pretend it's not happening, as many people in Rotherham did, then you go down the road of condoning it. You're actually saying, this is all right, because it's what they do in that community. Well, it's not. It's not all right.
Hello, very nice to meet you.